Welcome back to Moments That Matter. Our guest today is Dr. Christina Sinisi, professor and chair of the psychology department at Charleston Southern University. She has been at CSU for 25 years. She is married to Kyle Sinisi, a professor at the Citadel, and she has 2 grown children. Christina and I recently met at a Christian Writers Conference, and I thought it would be interesting to talk with her about how she became a professor and an author, including the moments that matter that have directed her life. So welcome, Christina.
Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things I tell my students is that they probably imagine I've been a professor all my life, but that in fact, the path to being a professor was anything but straight. What led you to being a professor of psychology, and especially the moments that matter along the way in your life?
First off, it's going to be sort of funny because I am the actual opposite. I went straight through. I never took a break. I never did anything else. So that's a different route. But the thing is, people get places differently. Now, how I became a psychology professor is a different route in that forgive me, those who employ me, it was never my first love. Psychology is never. I started writing as soon as I possibly could. I grew up in the mountains in Virginia on a farm, so not even in a town. And we didn't have kindergarten. So I went to first grade knowing nothing. And by third grade, I was starting to write poetry.
Oh.
And in fifth grade, I wrote a play for my class the people in my group acted out my play. Eighth grade, I wrote my first novel. And then in high school, I found that in English class, I don't particularly care to pick apart a novel or a piece of writing. I like to write better. I like to learn how to write and to improve, but I really don't like picking apart other people's writing. So, what did they really mean here? So English was not starting, it wasn't looking like the path I wanted to go, even though I wanted to write. And then I read Sylvia Plath and The Bell Jar. And I just was a voracious reader. So this was among many things I read. The Bell Jar and then Sybil. And I started thinking, if I learn more about people and how people tick, then I could be a better writer in that I would know how to write about my characters and give them depth. And then I also found I actually enjoy doing research. So that's how I decided to major in psychology, just because I picked these books up that I would, and there wasn't like I had a psychology class in high school. My little high school didn't offer it. So it was merely, just trying to figure out how can I write better without having to agonize over what somebody really meant by this word here.
Oh, I get that. My wife studied psychology for pretty much the same, reason. She just wanted to understand people. That's she didn't want to necessarily, pursue it any further.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to being a professor, you've mentioned already the writing that you've done, but and is of course not unusual for a professor to write, but you write fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be a little bit of a surprise to our listeners. So who got you interested in writing those kinds of books in the first place?
So that's my first love, is writing fiction. I mean, I wrote poetry in third grade. And when I chose my college for undergraduate, Hollins College, which is still an all-female undergraduate institution with a few master's programs, it is known for its psychology program. It was known at the time, and it's been known all along for its creative writing master's in fine arts program. So I chose that college because it had both.
Mm-hmm.
And my whole time there, I majored in psychology, but I took creative writing courses every semester, and they had the undergraduate and graduate students in the critique groups in the same courses. So you had a lot of exposure to people who could write. Mm-hmm. Then I graduated from college, and for some reason, God puts his hand on us in very interesting ways. So in first grade, I told a friend that I was going to become a doctor, and nobody could stop me. And this is from a little girl whose parents, my father was the first to get a high school diploma in his family, and my mother only had a GED. Mm-hmm. No idea where that came from. So I signed up, I applied and got in grad school for psychology, but in that summer in between, I wrote a novel. I submitted it, and it was rejected, and I didn't know what to do. My undergrad, for all it's teaching me how to write, never taught me the business of writing. So I just let it drop. I let my writing drop throughout the rest of my graduate school career, becoming a professor, and until my daughter started school, where she would be in kindergarten full time. That's when I picked up writing again. But I just let it go because I needed to have a paying career. And nobody, even now, I've talked to a young lady on Saturday in my local writing group. She graduated and they still don't teach the business of writing. Here you wrote this thing. What do you do with it so you can make a living at what you love? They didn't teach it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just ran into a Facebook post about the writing process. Actually, are you part of that 540 club?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So you probably just saw that. And it's so fascinating because you read that and if you don't know anything about publishing, the back and forth and back and forth and back and this person and that person and review and review and review. It's just kind of surprising. But sometimes, as you say, you don't even hardly get your foot in the door. And that's kind of the part of the business too. Yeah. So have you had a mentor through this process?
And that's one of the things I had brought up that I wanted to talk about, because it was the series of people. Once I got back into it that second time, a local author had donated a book to the local library and put in her information. And then I saw her name in the newspaper for a book signing. And I went to that book signing and she said, "Oh, we have a local group, Low Country Romance Writers," which is still a part of the National Romance Writers of America. I joined, I became active, and they taught me the business. Mm-hmm. That group taught me the business of how to get in. And while I was being active, I served as every office that you could have in that group, except for treasurer, because I can't do that. While I was vice president, we had vice president ran the programs, and the person before me had actually scheduled Eloisa James, who is a New York Times best-selling author. And I picked her up at the airport. She got, she walked down and where I could see her, and we were like, "Oh, you look like me." And then we found out she is married to an Italian, like I am. She has a boy and a girl, like I do. She's a professor, like I am. I mean, we just had so much in common. So that day, as I'm driving her around and doing my job as the vice president, we got to know each other and really liked each other. And then as I'm driving her to her hotel, she said, "Why don't you send me some of your stuff?" And I said, "Oh, I'd love to, but I would never have asked." And she said, "Because you didn't ask, you didn't push, I would love to." And so then she became my mentor and my friend. And I've had other people who've helped along the way, but she is the person who, I was writing fantasy, science, it's fantasy / science fiction, and I just wasn't getting anywhere. I would get really close with a New York editor, or I was in a national magazine called Romantic Times. I was in a film with her. as my mentor, but I wasn't getting accepted. And she said, why don't you write inspirational fiction? Because your faith is a really big part of who you are, and you're not doing that. You're not paying attention to who you really are. And that was the key. Is writing about, not just writing, what you enjoy, but writing who you are. To me, that's the key.
And can you tell us what you've had published and what you're working on?
Right now, I've had 2 novellas, several poems, several short stories, and I have another novel coming out in July and another one that's been accepted for publication for the next year. So, and I'm 200 pages in on the next one.
All right. My goodness. Yeah. So this second wave has been very productive for you. Okay.
Absolutely.
And how much time are we talking about? How many years are we talking about that this is all taken?
Well, the interesting thing is, when I was part of the Low Country Romance Writers, my daughter is now 23 and she was 5 when I got into that group. So there were years of me really trying and not getting anywhere other than, that close, right there. The New York editor I had an editor one time, he gave me like 30 revisions, and I made those revisions, and they said, this isn't what we want. So, I got that close. And then once she said, why don't you become an inspirational writer? That was about 6 or 7 years ago. You would think, if it's the key, why didn't it happen faster? Well, in between, my other career didn't just go away.
Yeah.
All along, I had been psych advisor at my campus, but I'm just this person who gets active. So I was very active with that. My chapter, this little bitty university, we won, while I was advisor, regional chapter of the year 3 times, national twice. I was regional advisor of the year. And then I became elected Southeastern vice president and served on the national board.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was vice president for Psych, so that's after she told me I should write Christian inspirational romance. When I was vice president, I couldn't write. I just, I was in charge of a conference and so on. Mm-hmm. So there was a year where I didn't write. The second year of being vice president, I sat down and I started to write because I couldn't not write.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was not reelected. There was some political things going on. I'm fine with that now. It's God worked. He gave me that experience. I wanted that experience. And then I wasn't reelected. I was nominated to be president, which is national. I wasn't elected for that. And I was like, I'm going back to full-time writing, and and I had stopped even being part of the local romance writers group. Part of it's because they had become too, I'm trying to think of a politic word. Romance has many areas to it, and I've always known that, and I've always been fine. But now that group doesn't really allow you to just be fine with it. They want you to embrace the aspect of possible romance. And I'm not comfortable. Using you go to a meeting. I went back to a meeting just to see when I got back this third time writing, and the language they were using, I wasn't comfortable. So I looked up the American Christian Fiction Writers. Yeah. They told me about that group, and I joined the local chapter, and on the national email loop for American Christian Fiction Writers. So this was just literally the next summer after I had started back writing after being Psych vice president. I saw a call for Christmas novellas on June 9th of 2019, due by the end of the month. And I wrote a novella in 3.5 weeks.
Wow.
And that's when I finally got published. And since then, now that I've gotten that encouragement, I'm writing, still being a professor, and I'm writing 2 books a year.
Mm-hmm. So. And you're continuing with the same company, aren't you?
I am. But I've started, because 2019 is not that long ago. I've started, but branching out, I've gotten, I put a short story in for the compilation from the conference and got that accepted. And I've submitted to a digital magazine. And so I'm branching out now that I've had.
That's great. That's great.
That's amazing to hear how all that comes together. For someone, I've kind of always had this question in my mind. How do you go about creating your characters and the intricacies of their personalities? What is the inspiration for creating those individuals and then the storyline that they interact through? For you, where do you get your inspiration?
Well, the good news, even though all those years I wasn't getting published, I was attending conferences and seminars and workshops and so on. I will usually start with just a germ of an idea. And for that, the novella that only took me 3.5 weeks, I literally looked up how long is a novella supposed to be, divided by the number of days I had left, with a couple days to revise. And then I just looked around at that. I look around at people that I know, and I use them as a starting point, and then I'll have the characters branch out from there. But there's an author, Deb Dixon, wrote a book called Goal, Motivation, and Conflict. And her book has these charts where you ask yourself for each character, what's their goal, their motivation, conflict, internal, external. And then I'll keep a notebook with physical characteristics. And I usually will have in mind for the physical characteristics somebody I know. But then again, I'll branch off and just not make they're not the same person. That, this person that was started as the germ of an idea. The character becomes his or her own person. I also use Alexandra Sokolov's storyboarding techniques, where you plot using the 3-act structure on a poster board, and that leads out to the whole story.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.